The desert doesn't just swallow things, it digests them, slowly, in a long, sun-bleached stomach of red sand and alkaline dust. I could taste the copper in the back of my throat long before I reached the rusted skeleton of the Happy Jack mine. They called it a lucrative contract, a term that usually translates to danger money in my line of work. The Department of Energy was offering a salary that felt more like a bribe, a staggering double pay rate for a routine structural survey of a site that had been officially dead since the Reagan administration. It was a sum that could wipe my debts and buy me a year of silence, so I didn't ask why they needed a private contractor instead of their own bloated team of engineers. I just took the check and drove into the scorched void of Utah, unaware that I was selling my soul to a hole in the earth. My truck rattled over the washboard roads, the silence of the San Juan County canyons pressing in against the glass like a physical weight, until the jagged headframes of the mine rose out of the heat haze like the ribs of a dead god. The air at the mouth of Shaft 7 was thick, an anaerobic soup of stagnant heat and the faint, metallic tang of decaying uranium. Every surface was a canvas of oxidation, painted in the violent oranges and deep browns of 40 years of neglect. My boots crunched over old timber that crumbled like bone under the slightest pressure, and the silence was a pulsating pressure against my eardrums. My flashlight beam was a weak, flickering umbilical cord connecting me to the world of the living, cutting through a darkness that felt dense enough to bruise. I was there to map the collapse risks, but the deeper I went into the throat of the mine, the more the geography felt wrong. The walls were weeping a thick, black moisture that looked more like oil than water, and the timbers groaned with a rhythmic cadence that sounded too much like heavy breathing. Then I found it, buried at the furthest reaches of the primary drift. Hidden beneath a layer of discarded ore sacks and a rotted wooden pallet was a heavy trapdoor. On any other site, this would have been a footnote, a forgotten access hatch fused shut by decades of rust and salt. But when my light grazed the metal, the reflection didn't scatter or die in the dust. It bounced back with a sharp, surgical precision that made my stomach drop into my boots. I stopped, the only sound the frantic, mechanical clicking of my Geiger counter, which remained unnervingly low despite the reputation of this place. I knelt, the grit of the mine floor biting into my knees, and swept my hand over the door. The hinges were the first thing that set off the alarms in my head. They weren't orange. They weren't fused. They were polished chrome, gleaming with a cold, silver light that had no business existing in this tomb. There was no screech of metal on metal, no evidence of structural failure. Most terrifyingly, the perimeter of the door was sealed with a bead of black industrial polymer. I reached out and pressed my thumb against the sealant. It didn't crumble. It didn't crack. It was soft, tacky. It was fresh. It was as if someone had just finished applying it minutes before I stepped into the chamber. In a place where everything was supposed to be a memory, this was a heartbeat. The contrast was a violent intrusion of the modern world into a forgotten grave. My mind tried to construct a rational lie, a desperate narrative to keep the panic from rising. Maybe another team had been here. Maybe it was a secret maintenance check I hadn't been briefed on. But the DOE reports I had memorized were explicit. Shaft 7 had been sealed and unvisited since the mid-80s. The metal under my hand felt unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the shaft. I wipe away a layer of dust from the center of the hatch to find a keypad, its LED display glowing with a faint, malevolent green. I stared at that polished metal, my flashlight flickering as if it too was shivering in the dark, and I realized that I wasn't just surveying a ruin. I was standing on top of a secret that was still breathing, still functioning, and still being maintained by someone who didn't want to be found. The suspicion began to rot in my gut, a slow-acting poison that whispered that the double pay wasn't for my expertise, but for my eventual silence. This wasn't a survey. It was an entry point into something that hadn't finished eating, a gateway that was being kept clean in the middle of a rotting corpse. I stood there in the flickering gloom, the shadows of the mine walls stretching out like long, black fingers, and I knew that the door hadn't been built to keep things out of the mine. It had been built to keep something in. The Utah desert is a place where God went to die, leaving only the red dust and the silence to bury him. By the second night at the Happy Jack mine, that silence had become a physical weight, a suffocating shroud of cold air and radioactive dust. I sat in my tent, the nylon walls shivering against a wind that felt less like weather and more like a warning. My mind kept looping back to that hatch in Shaft 7. Those hinges, they were too clean. In a place where every bolt had been eaten away by 40 years of oxidation, those hinges were a surgical intrusion of the present into a dead past. I felt like I had stepped into a tomb only to find the corpse had been recently manicured. It started exactly at 3 a.m. It wasn't a sound. Not at first. It was a pressure, a sudden thickening of the air that made my eardrums throb with a dull, rhythmic ache. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was slow, agonizingly steady, like the heartbeat of a mountain. I sat up in my cot, the cold biting at my skin, and realized the water in my plastic cup was rippling in perfect, concentric circles. There was no wind outside now. The desert had gone dead. No coyotes, no crickets, not even the rustle of sagebrush. Just that pulse, vibrating up through the prehistoric rock, through the soles of my feet, and settling deep in my marrow. I reached for my field kit. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from a primal, lizard-brain panic that had suddenly hijacked my nervous system. I fumbled with the industrial-grade microphone, the one I used to check for structural echoes and gas pockets. I rigged it to the laptop and hit record. The screen flared to life, casting a sickly, gangrenous green glow across the interior of the tent. It was the only light for 20 miles, a digital wound in the middle of the dark. I opened the spectral analysis software and watched the waveform. For a moment, there was nothing but the flat line of ambient static. Then, the pulse hit again. A massive, jagged peak spiked on the monitor. It was a low-frequency wave, so deep it was below the threshold of human hearing, but it was there, screaming in the data. I stared at the digital readout. 18.98 Hertz. The number felt like a curse. I am a surveyor, a man of mathematics and cold geology, and I knew exactly what that frequency meant. 18.98 Hertz is what researchers call the ghost frequency. It is the precise resonant frequency of the human eye. When you are exposed to it, your eyeballs begin to vibrate within their sockets, just enough to distort your peripheral vision. It creates shadows that aren't there. It makes you see flickering, grey shapes dancing at the edge of your sight. But it does more than just trick the eyes. It resonates with the inner ear, triggering a subcortical response of absolute, unmitigated dread. It is a biological kill switch for peace of mind. I sat there, bathed in that rotting green light, watching the wave pulse. It was too consistent to be natural. It wasn't the shifting of tectonic plates or the settling of old timber. It was a broadcast, a rhythmic, calculated emission of infrasound designed to make any living thing within a 5-mile radius feel a crushing sense of doom. It was an acoustic fence, a way to keep people away without ever having to fire a shot. The dread was an oily slick in my stomach. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, and my skin began to crawl as if 1,000 microscopic insects were burrowing beneath the surface. I turned my head toward the tent flap, convinced that someone, or something, was standing just outside, staring through the thin fabric with empty, lightless eyes. I could feel the gaze. It was heavy, judgmental, and hungry. But when I checked the thermal feed on my secondary monitor, there was nothing but the cooling desert floor. Yet the feeling persisted. The 18.98 Hertz hum was vibrating my very soul. I looked back at the screen, my eyes watering from the strain. The pulse was getting stronger, the peaks on the oscilloscope growing sharper, more violent. It felt like the mind was trying to communicate, or perhaps it was trying to shake me apart, cell by cell. The clock on the corner of the screen ticked toward 3:14 a.m. The moment the digits flipped, the pressure vanished. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a vacuum, a sudden removal of a weight that left me gasping for air. The green line on the monitor went flat. I sat in the darkness. The afterimage of the glowing waveform burned into my retinas like a brand. Why 3:14? 14 minutes of infrasonic bombardment. Every night. It was a schedule. Someone, or something, was running a machine beneath the Utah silt, a machine that functioned on a timer deep in the bowels of Shaft 7. I thought about those clean hinges again. The hatch wasn't just being used, it was part of a lung. And I was sitting right over the windpipe. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed huddled in that green glow, clutching my record of the ghost frequency like a talisman. I kept thinking about the technicians who had been here before me. Jim Dean, the man whose name I'd seen on the old manifests. Had he sat here too? Had he watched his water ripple while his eyes vibrated in their sockets? I looked at the shadows in the corner of my tent, the ones that wouldn't go away even after the pulse stopped. They seemed to be stretching, reaching out from the mind's mouth, waiting for the sun to go down again. I realized then that I wasn't just surveying a mine. I was documenting a haunting that had been engineered by human hands, or something that had learned to mimic them very, very well. The air in the tent felt thin, oxygen depleted, as if the mine were inhaling everything around it, including my resolve. I was no longer an observer. I was a witness to something that the earth had been forced to swallow, and now it was beginning to spit it back up. The silence of the following hours was punctuated only by the distant, metallic groans of the mine headframe, like a gallows swinging in a graveyard wind. I replayed the recording over and over, zooming in on the jagged green peaks. There was a secondary layer to the sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching buried within the 18.98 Hertz wave. It sounded like metal on bone. It sounded like something trying to dig its way out of a pressurized chamber. I felt the metallic taste of copper on my tongue, a sign of high-altitude stress or, more likely here, the taste of my own fear-induced adrenaline. I looked out at the silhouette of Shaft 7 against the starlight. It looked like a blackened tooth in a rotting jaw. The desert wasn't just empty, it was erased. Everything about this job, the double pay, the vague NDAs, the lack of a proper site briefing, started to coalesce into a singular, terrifying shape. I was being paid to ignore the impossible. I was being paid to stand watch over a void that was actively screaming at me in a language my ears couldn't hear, but my heart understood perfectly. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, I saw the nosebleed. A single, dark drop of crimson fell onto the glowing green laptop screen, right on top of the 18.98 Hertz peak. It looked black under the oscilloscope's light. I wiped my face, and my hand came away wet. My body was reacting to the frequency, the physical toll of the infrasound vibrating my capillaries until they burst. I wasn't alone in the desert. I was being unmade by it. And the worst part, the part that kept me from packing my bags and driving until the gas ran out, was the realization that the frequency hadn't just been a deterrent. It had been an invitation. Something down there now knew the exact resonance of my body. It had tuned itself to me. I spent the daylight hours of the third day moving like a ghost myself. The sun was a harsh, judgmental eye in a cloudless sky, but it offered no warmth. I went back to Shaft 7, my boots crunching on the salt-crusted earth. I stood by the mouth of the shaft and looked down. The air coming up from the darkness was cold, colder than it had any right to be in the Utah summer. It smelled of ozone and ancient, stagnant water. I thought about the 18.98 Hertz pulse and how it felt like a physical hand pressing against my chest. I checked the perimeter sensors I'd set up. They were all showing system error. Every single one of them had been fried, their internal circuits fused as if hit by a targeted electromagnetic pulse. All except for my laptop, which I had kept shielded in my lead-lined equipment case. It was the only thing that had captured the truth. I thought about Mark, my colleague. He was a few hundred yards away in his own tent, but he might as well have been on the moon. We didn't talk much. We were both professionals, but the mine was doing something to him too. I'd seen him staring at the ground for hours, his lips moving in a silent prayer or a frantic counting. He wasn't recording the frequencies. He was listening to the silence. Did you hear it? I'd asked him over coffee that morning. Mark hadn't looked up. He just stared into his black coffee, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. It is not about hearing, he'd whispered. It is about the weight. Can't you feel how heavy the dirt is getting? His words stayed with me as the shadows began to grow long again. The dirt was heavy. It felt like the entire state of Utah was leaning on that one mine shaft, trying to keep the lid on a boiling pot. I returned to my tent as the sun dipped behind the jagged mesas, turning the world the color of a bruised plum. 3 a.m. was coming. I knew it. I could feel the anticipation in my teeth. I sat in front of my laptop, the green glow ready to illuminate my descent into madness. I had adjusted the software to filter out the ambient noise even further, hoping to catch whatever was hidden in that 18.98 Hertz wave. The clock hit 3 o'clock. The thrumming returned with a violence that made the tent poles groan. This time, it wasn't just a pulse, it was a sequence. A series of long and short bursts. A code. My vision blurred instantly, the ghost frequency vibrating my retinas until the laptop screen looked like a smeared mess of emerald light. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to lean over and retch into the dust. My head felt like it was being squeezed in a vice of pure gravity. I looked at the oscilloscope. The wave wasn't a simple sine wave anymore. It was complex. It was modulated. Within the 18.98 Hertz carrier signal, there was a voice. Not a human voice, but a mechanical approximation of one, a jagged, stuttering arrangement of frequencies that mimicked the cadence of speech. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the intent. It was a beckoning. It was the sound of something deep in the earth recognizing a visitor. The dread was no longer an external force. It was a symbiotic connection. I realized that the frequency wasn't just designed to cause fear. It was designed to prepare the brain for what was coming next. It was a tuning fork, and I was the instrument being played. Exactly at 3:14 a.m., the world went dead again. I sat there in the dark, my nose bleeding steadily onto my shirt, the green glow of the screen reflecting in the dark pool of blood on the desk. I looked at the tent flap. I knew that if I opened it, the shadows wouldn't be peripheral anymore. They would be standing right there, waiting for the frequency to start again. I was caught in a loop of mathematical horror, a surveyor of a terrain that didn't exist on any map. Shaft 7 was breathing, and I was counting every breath, waiting for the one that would finally swallow me whole. I needed to know what Jim Dean had found. I needed to see the pages they had blacked out before the frequency shook the skin right off my bones. The desert doesn't just swallow bodies, it swallows histories. It erases the footprint before the boot even leaves the sand. Mark sat across from me in the cramped, salt-crusted interior of the survey trailer, his face a map of twitching nerves and jagged shadows. The overhead fluorescent hummed with a sick, flickering yellow light that made the air feel like it was curdling. He didn't speak. He just slid a manila folder across the formica table. It was heavy, weighted down by the kind of secrets that turn a man's hair white before he's 40. I reached out, my fingers trembling. The paper felt cold, unnervingly smooth, like the skin of something that had been dead for a long time. This was the phantom file, the ghost of the happy Jack Mine. I opened it, and the smell of ozone and stale, bureaucratic rot filled my nostrils. It was a Department of Energy incident report, dated August 2019. At the top of the page, the name Jim Dean was printed in a sterile, sans serif font that felt like a slap in the face. Jim Dean, my predecessor, the man whose shoes I was currently filling, whose ghost I was currently chasing into the radioactive dark of Shaft 7. I looked at the photograph clipped to the inner margin. Dean looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and was just waiting for the invoice. His eyes were recessed into deep, bruised hollows, and his mouth was set in a hard, jagged line of suppressed terror. He looked less like a technician and more like a sacrificial lamb. Mark leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely cut through the static of the desert wind howling outside. He told me to look at the logs. I turned the page. Dean's notes started out professional: structural integrity, radiation counts, ventilation flow. But by the second week, the handwriting began to disintegrate. The letters became sharp, violent slashes across the page. He wrote about the pressure. Not the atmospheric pressure of the mine, but a rhythmic, thumping weight that seemed to sit on his chest every night at 3 a.m. He had recorded the same 18.98 Hertz frequency that was currently vibrating through my own marrow. Then I hit the wall. Page 2 wasn't just redacted, it was a cemetery. Every single line, every single word, had been obliterated by thick, oily black ink. It wasn't the neat, digital redaction you see in declassified memos. This was visceral. The ink had been applied with such force that it had warped the paper, creating a raised, topographical map of silence. It looked like a void. It looked like someone had poured a bottle of midnight over the truth and let it harden into a scab. I held the page up to the flickering light, trying to see through the darkness, but the ink was impenetrable. It was a high-contrast abyss. Whatever Jim Dean had seen at the bottom of Shaft 7, whatever he had heard beneath the rhythmic throb of that infrasound, was now a state secret. "It's not just the report," Mark whispered, his eyes darting to the thin trailer door as if expecting a tactical team to burst through the aluminum. I checked the national databases. Dean's credentials? Revoked. His pension? Vanished. His social security number is a dead signal. It's like the government reached into the machinery of reality and plucked him out with a pair of tweezers. The paranoia began to coil around my throat like a cold, wet rope. I looked back at the blacked-out page. In the margins of the ink void, I could see the tiny, frantic scratches of a pen Dean had tried to write around the edges. I could make out fragments, words that felt like shards of broken glass. "Not a mine," one said. "A throat," said another. And at the very bottom, nearly lost in the crease of the folder, "It knows my name." The 18.98 Hertz frequency isn't just a sound, I realized. It's a signature. It's the sound of the brain's fear center being tuned like a guitar string until it snaps. They knew it was there. They didn't hire me to survey a mine. They hired me to see if the frequency was still working, to see if the thing in the dark was still hungry. I looked at Mark, and for a second, his face seemed to blur, his features dissolving into the same black static that covered Dean's report. The high-contrast shadows in the trailer grew longer, reaching out like skeletal fingers. I felt the vibration again, a deep, subperceptual pulse coming from the earth beneath the trailer's thin floor. It wasn't 3 a.m. yet, but the ground was already beginning to hum. Jim Dean didn't quit. He didn't retire. He was digested. He was erased because he found the seam where the world ends and the nightmare begins. And now, I was holding the same papers he held, breathing the same irradiated dust, and listening to the same heartbeat of the void. I turned back to the first page, staring at Dean's face. I noticed something I had missed before. In the photograph, behind him, the hatch of Shaft 7 was visible. Even in the grainy, low-light shot from 3 years ago, the hinges were the same. Clean, polished, no rust, no decay. The door was a silver grin in a face of crumbling stone. The documents felt like lead in my hands. I wanted to burn them. I wanted to grind them into the salt flats and drive until the engine exploded. But the black ink on page 2 stared back at me, a blind eye that saw everything. I wasn't just reading a report. I was reading my own obituary, written in a language of silence and redacted by a hand that didn't have fingers. The static in my head grew louder, a white noise that tasted like copper and old blood. Mark stood up, his movements sudden and jagged. "We need to leave," he said, but his eyes stayed fixed on the folder. "We can't leave," I countered, the words feeling heavy and wrong in my mouth. "They're already watching the GPS. They're already in the wires." I looked at the blacked-out page 1 last time. Under the harsh, backlit glare of the desk lamp, the ink seemed to shimmer, moving like a pool of stagnant water. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a shape beneath the black, a face, pressed against the underside of the paper, screaming without a mouth. I slammed the folder shut, but the image stayed burned into my retinas. Jim Dean was the warning. I was the repeat, and the frequency was just the countdown. I looked out the window toward the silhouette of the headframe of Shaft 7, standing like a gallows against the starlight. It was waiting. It was always waiting. The hole in the earth didn't need a map. It had my scent. It had my name. And according to the black void in my hands, I no longer existed. I looked out the window toward the silhouette of the headframe of Shaft 7, standing like a gallows against the starlight. It was waiting. It was always waiting. The hole in the earth didn't need a map. It had my scent. It had my name. And according to the black void in my hands, I no longer existed. The contract had arrived in a plain manila envelope, heavy with the weight of promises that should have been warnings. They called it a survey of the Happy Jack Mine. Utah, 1970s uranium remnants. The pay was a joke, or rather, a bribe, double the industry standard for a 3-week stint in the high desert. I took it because debt is a different kind of darkness, one that bites harder than a mountain lion. But the moment I reached the rusted perimeter of Shaft 7, the math stopped making sense. This place was supposed to be a tomb of 1980s decay, a rusted relic of the Cold War. Yet, when I kneeled over the heavy iron trapdoor leading into the primary vent, my flashlight caught something impossible. The hinges weren't screaming with 40 years of oxidation. They were clean. They were slick with a layer of industrial grease that still smelled of synthetic oil. The sealant around the rim was fresh, a bead of black silicone that still had a tacky, elastic give to it. Someone, or something, was opening this door every single day. The desert had reclaimed the rest of the Happy Jack, but Shaft 7 was being kept alive, its throat kept open and lubricated for whatever needed to slide down into the gut of the earth. The first night was just the wind. The second night, the world changed. I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was a rhythmic, thrumming pressure that didn't enter through my ears but through my sternum. A dull, subterranean pulse that felt like a giant heart beating miles beneath the sandstone. It was a physical weight, a tectonic drumming that made the water in my canteen ripple in perfect, concentric circles. I sat there in the dark, my teeth vibrating in my gums, watching the red digits of my clock. 3 o'clock, 3:05, 3:10. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the pressure vanished. The silence that followed was worse. It was the sound of something holding its breath. I spent the next day rigging my digital recorder to a high-fidelity preamp. When I ran the audio through the analyzer, the waveform wasn't a random spike. It was a sustained, artificial tone at exactly 18.98 Hertz. The ghost frequency, infrasound. It is the precise ditan that resonates with the human eye, causing blurred vision and gray hallucinations at the edge of the peripheral. It triggers the amygdala, the primitive lizard brain that screams predator even when the room is empty. Someone was pumping a fear frequency into the desert air, turning the very atmosphere into a weapon of psychological warfare. Mark noticed it too. He was a veteran of these sites, a man whose skin looked like cured leather and whose eyes usually held nothing but boredom. But after that second night, Mark looked haunted. He cornered me in the mess tent, his hand shaking as he slid a crumpled document across the table. It was a Department of Energy incident report from 2019. The name on the header was Jim Dean, the technician who had been out here before us. Dean's report started normally: equipment checks, radiation levels, structural integrity. But by the second page, the text became a sea of black. Total redaction. Rows of ink-heavy bars obliterated every observation Dean had made about Shaft 7. Mark leaned in, his voice a jagged whisper, telling me that Dean's professional license hadn't just been revoked, the man had been erased. No social security activity, no bank movements, no death certificate. He had walked into the Happy Jack and slipped through a crack in reality. Then came the suits. Gabriel Luna and Elaine Phillips. They didn't arrive in a government vehicle. They appeared out of the heat haze in a black SUV with no plates. They didn't ask for our logs. They produced a warrant that smelled of high-level clearance and went straight for the trapdoor at Shaft 7. I watched from the monitors as they rigged a heavy-duty winch. They didn't look like inspectors. They looked like sacrifices. They disappeared into the dark, their GPS pings appearing as 2 green dots on my tablet. The official schematics of the Happy Jack showed the mine bottoming out at 280 feet. I watched the numbers climb. 280, 300, 320. At 340 feet, the green dots began to flicker. They were in a space that didn't exist, a void beneath the mine's floor. Then, at 4:17 p.m., the signal didn't just fade, it snapped. Both heart rate monitors flatlined simultaneously. The winch cable went slack, then began to hiss as it was pulled downward by a force that wasn't gravity. They never signaled. They never screamed. They just became part of the 18.98 Hertz hum. That night, the pulsing stopped. The 3 a.m. drumbeat was replaced by something far more intimate. I was lying in my bunk, staring at the canvas ceiling, when I heard it. It wasn't a sound from the ground. It was a voice, coming from the direction of the shaft. It didn't have the resonance of a human throat. It sounded like a recording played through a layer of wet silt. It spoke my full name. Every syllable was perfect, every inflection precise, but it lacked the air of a living being. It was a vocalization of stone. I stayed frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, until the sun finally bled over the horizon. I went to find Mark. His tent was flapping open in the morning breeze. His bed was made, but his boots were gone. I followed the drag marks in the dust, a frantic, jagged trail that led straight to the lip of Shaft 7. There, sitting on the very edge of the abyss, was Mark's personal digital recorder. It was still running, the little red light blinking like a dying eye. I reached for it, but the air coming out of the hole was different now. It didn't smell like old uranium and dust. It smelled like rotting meat and ozone, a visceral, metallic stench that made my stomach turn. I didn't pick up the recorder. I couldn't. I saw the way the fresh grease on the hinges caught the morning light, and I knew if I stayed one more second, I would be the one lubricating them. I ran. I didn't pack. I didn't look back. I threw my gear into the truck and tore across the salt flats, my heart screaming. That's when the nosebleed started. Not a trickle, but a heavy, hot flow of copper-tasting blood that stained my shirt and splattered the steering wheel. It wouldn't stop. It was as if the pressure from the mine was still inside me, trying to push its way out. I drove straight to the regional DOE office in Moab. I had the hard drive. I had the infrasound recordings. I had the GPS logs showing Luna and Phillips falling into a void 340 feet down. I thought I was bringing evidence. I thought I was bringing the truth. The woman behind the desk didn't look surprised. She looked disappointed. She didn't call the police. She called 2 men in grey tactical gear who were waiting in the hall. They didn't use handcuffs. They just took the drive. They took my phone. They even took the keys to my truck, citing an environmental assessment of my vehicle due to potential contamination. They handed me a termination of contract notice and a non-disclosure agreement that felt like a death warrant. Now, I'm sitting in a motel room that smells of cheap bleach and old cigarettes. The nosebleed has been going on for 4 hours, a slow, steady leak of my life onto the thin white sheets. I tried to call Mark's wife, but his number is disconnected. I tried to look up Jim Dean, and the search engine returned 0 results. Not a ghost, not a trace. I am staring at the blood on my hands, realizing the mistake I made. I didn't just hand over the evidence, I handed over my existence. I am a ghost in a cheap motel, and the only thing that knows I'm still alive is the thing under the Utah desert. Because even now, over the sound of the air conditioner, I can feel it. 18.98 Hertz. A vibration in my teeth. A pulse in my marrow. It knows where I am. It knows my name. And it's still waiting for me to come home to Shaft 7. The motel room smells like old cigarettes and the metallic tang of my own slow death. The air conditioner is a dying beast, rattling in its cage, but it cannot mask the frequency. It is a hum that bypasses the ears and vibrates directly into the soft tissue of the brain. 18.98 Hertz. The frequency of ghost sightings. The frequency that makes the human eye resonate and see grey shapes in the periphery. But these aren't ghosts. Ghosts are memories. What is under Shaft 7 is a hunger that predates memory. My nose began to bleed again 10 minutes ago. It is a thick, dark crimson that looks almost black under the flickering fluorescent light of the bathroom. I don't bother wiping it away anymore. The white porcelain of the sink is already mapped with the geography of my failure. The last night at the camp remains etched into my retinas like a burn-in on an old monitor. The moonlight was a pale, sickly shroud over the Utah desert, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach for the tent flaps. The silence was the worst part. 4 nights, the 18.98 Hertz pulse had been a rhythmic thud, a subterranean heartbeat that stopped at 3:14 a.m. But that night, the rhythm broke. The pressure in my chest vanished, leaving a vacuum so intense it felt like my lungs would collapse. I checked my watch. 3:14 a.m. exactly. I waited for the silence to settle, for the desert wind to take over. Instead, a voice drifted up from the throat of Shaft 7. It didn't have the resonance of a human throat. There was no breath behind it, no vibration of vocal cords. It was a flat, synthesized imitation of life, a mimicry of sound produced by something that had only ever heard echoes. It spoke my name, not just my first name. It recited my full legal name, including the middle initial I haven't used since I was a child. It whispered it with the cadence of a funeral rite. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I sat in my sleeping bag, my skin crawling with a cold sweat that felt like oil. Then I heard Mark's tent zipper. I wanted to scream at him to stay inside, to bolt the flap, to pray to a god neither of us believed in. But my jaw was locked. I heard his boots crunching on the dry, irradiated earth. He was walking toward the shaft. He wasn't running. He was shuffling, like a sleepwalker being pulled by an invisible tether. I listened to his footsteps get fainter and fainter until they stopped at the edge of the pit. I waited for a scream. I waited for a thud. I waited for anything. Nothing came. Only the wind, and then, the sound of Mark's digital recorder clicking on. When the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon, I forced myself out of the tent. The campsite was a ghost town. Mark's tent was wide open, the interior a hollow ribcage of nylon and abandoned gear. His boots were gone. His truck was still there, coated in a fine layer of red dust. I found his recorder sitting on the very edge of the Shaft 7 opening. It was perched precariously, as if waiting to be tipped over. The red light was still blinking. Recording. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I looked down into the darkness of the shaft, and for a split second, the shadows at the bottom seemed to shift, moving in a way that defied the laws of light. They didn't retreat from the sun. They swallowed it. I turned and ran for my truck, leaving everything behind. My gear, my dignity, and Mark. The drive back to civilization was a blur of high-speed panic and the onset of the nosebleeds. I thought the federal authorities would help. I thought the data on my hard drive, the GPS pings of Gabriel Luna and Elaine Phillips vanishing at 340 feet, the infrasound captures, the photos of those pristine, unrusted hinges, would be my shield. I was a fool. The woman at the regional office didn't look at the data. She didn't look at me. She moved with a bureaucratic coldness that was more terrifying than the voice in the desert. She took the drive. She signed a paper that effectively erased my contract, my pay, and my legal standing. When I walked back to the parking lot, my truck was gone. Towed for environmental evaluation, they said. Confiscated. They didn't just take my evidence, they took my mobility. They stripped me down to a body that is currently vibrating apart. I know what happened to Jim Dean now. He didn't just lose his license. He didn't just disappear. He was processed. He was a variable that the 18.98 Hertz pulse had finally resolved. The government isn't hiding a secret down there. They are feeding a machine. Or maybe a god. Something that requires the silence of the desert and the meat of the curious to keep its frequency stable. I can feel the motel floor beginning to hum. It's not the air conditioner. It's the ground. The Utah soil reaches all the way here, a subterranean network of veins and shafts that connect every basement and crawl space to that black hole in the desert. My phone is dead, but it doesn't matter. There is no one left to call. Mark is part of the 18.98 Hertz now. Luna and Phillips are still down there, past the 340-foot mark, in a space that doesn't exist on any map. And I am here, in a room that feels smaller by the second. The shadows in the corner are becoming denser, taking on a weight that shouldn't be possible. They aren't following the light from the street lamp outside. They are moving against the grain of reality. I can hear the click of a digital recorder. It's coming from under the bed. A soft, electronic chirp, followed by the sound of my own voice, recorded from a night I don't remember, reciting the coordinates of my own grave. The vibration is in my marrow now. It's in my teeth. It's the sound of a door with clean hinges opening in the dark. It knows I'm here. It knows my name. And the worst part, the part that makes me want to scream until my throat turns to glass, is that I'm starting to want to go back. I want to go back to the silence of Shaft 7. I want to see what is waiting at 340 feet. The desert is calling its property home, and I am nothing but a stray signal being tuned back into the static. The dawn didn't bring light. It only peeled back the shadows to reveal the carnage of my own nerves. I drove. I drove until the steering wheel was slick with the copper-scented leak from my nostrils, a steady, rhythmic drip that tapped against my thighs like a countdown. Every mile away from the Happy Jack mine felt like pulling a serrated wire through my own chest. The vibration was still there, tucked neatly behind my molars, humming at that godforsaken 18.98 Hertz, a frequency designed to make the human soul feel like an intruder in its own skin. Mark was gone. The recorders were gone. All I had left was the hard drive tucked into my jacket, the cold weight of it pressing against my ribs like a stolen organ. It contained the proof. The GPS coordinates of 2 federal agents vanishing into a hole that shouldn't exist. The audio files of a voice that had no business knowing my name. The images of those pristine, UN-rusted hinges in a tomb that had supposedly been sealed for 40 years. I reached the regional office in a haze of salt-crusted sweat and drying blood. I expected a lobby, a receptionist, the mundane bureaucracy of the Department of Energy. What I got was a windowless concrete slab on the outskirts of Moab and a woman whose eyes were as flat and grey as a dead television screen. She didn't ask me how the survey went. She didn't ask about Mark. She stood there in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the intake room, her hands folded over a metal table, waiting for me to break. And I did. I spilled it all. I told her about the pressure in the air at 3 a.m. I told her about Jim Dean and the redacted pages of a history that was being systematically inhaled by the government. I told her about Gabriel Luna and Delane Phillips disappearing into the dark at 4:17 p.m., their signals winking out like crushed fireflies. I handed her the drive. I handed her my life. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the humming in the mine. She didn't look at the drive. She slid it into a desk drawer and locked it with a click that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Then came the papers. A termination of contract for gross negligence and mental instability. Then came the keys. She demanded the keys to the company truck, citing a mandatory environmental assessment and biohazard protocol. I was standing there, my shirt stained with a week of desert grit and my own blood, and within 5 minutes, they had stripped me of everything. My transport, my evidence, my witness. They didn't even have to kill me. They just erased the world around me until I was the only thing left that didn't fit the narrative. Now, I sit in this motel room. The walls are thin enough to hear the desert wind screaming through the cracks, and the overhead light is a buzzing, sickly violet that makes my skin look like bruised fruit. The nosebleed hasn't stopped. It's a slow, thick transit of red that stains the cheap white polyester of the pillowcase. I try to call Mark's phone, but the operator tells me the number doesn't exist. I search for Jim Dean on the motel's ancient computer, but the screen just flickers into static every time I hit enter. There is no record of the survey. There is no record of the 18.98 Hertz. There is only the void. The most horrific part isn't the isolation or the government's cold, mechanical erasure of my existence. It's the sound. It's 3:14 a.m. The rhythmic pulsing has returned, but it's not coming from the ground anymore. It's coming from inside my chest. It's vibrating in my lungs, a low-frequency dread that tells me the mind didn't let me go. I am a walking transmitter for whatever breathes at 340 feet. I can feel the salt in the air, the taste of uranium, the cold, stale breath of Shaft 7 whispering against the back of my neck in this locked room. The government didn't take my truck because of a biohazard. They took it because I am no longer a man. I am a piece of the mind that wandered off, and they are just waiting for the signal to stabilize. My nose is bleeding again. The blood is black in this light. I realize now why Jim Dean's records were blacked out. It wasn't to hide what happened to him. It was because, by the end, there was nothing left of him but the ink. I am becoming the redacted text. I am becoming the static. And somewhere, deep beneath the Utah dirt, something is still calling my name, waiting for me to stop running and finally come home to the dark.